Greetings, my Terrorcons, and welcome to a very special Halloween reading video. I figured I would take a look at a book that I have a great degree of love towards, and one that I was inspired to get by another ASMR content creator, SleepyChicharoney ASMR. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. I'll be putting a link to her channel in the description below, as well as just giving a general shout out because I've been watching her videos pretty much for the past near enough 3, maybe 4 years. Many a sleepless night abroad, and many stressful sort of breaking into hotels, or breaking into hotels, wrong word, no, but breaking into new countries and dealing with just stress of being in an unfamiliar country. Her videos were always there for me during those rough nights. So if you're watching this, hey, well, it's probably the first time you hear my real voice, so yeah, I'm a I was gonna make a really off-color joke, but I decided against it. So cutting the crap, we're gonna be reading some scary stories to tell in the dark. And I made sure to specifically pick up this version of the book because the absolutely terrific illustrations. I mean, just look at the front cover alone. They sold this book in primary schools. You know, kids as young as maybe even 6 could have read these, and well, that's just crazy. So we're going to start with my personal favourite story in this book first, and we'll just pick random ones. But the first one we're going to pick is called The Haunted House. One time, a preacher went to see if he could put a haunt to rest at a house in his settlement. The house had been haunted for about 10 years. Several people had tried to stay there all night, but they would always get scared out by the haunt. So this preacher took his Bible and went to the house, went on in, built himself a good fire, and lit a lamp. Sat there reading the Bible. Then just before midnight, he heard something start up in the cellar, walking back and forth, back and forth. Then it sounded like somebody was trying to scream and got choked off. Then there was a lot of thrashing around and struggling, and finally, everything got quiet. The old preacher took up his Bible again, but before he could start reading, he heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. He sat watching the door to the cellar, and the footsteps kept coming closer and closer. He saw the doorknob turn, and when the door began to open, he jumped up and hollered, "What do you want?" The door shut back easy-like, and there wasn't a sound. The preacher was trembling a little, but he finally opened the Bible and read a while. Then he got up and laid the book on the chair and went to mending the fire. Then the haunt started walking again, and step, step, step up the cellar stairs. The old preacher sat watching the door, saw the doorknob turn, and the door open. It looked like a young woman. He backed up and said, "Who are you? What do you want?" Now, I'm just going to take a moment here to just gush over the absolutely horrific illustrations. If you'd shown this to me as a kid, I probably would have threw the book down, screamed, and ran into the other room. Because, look, I love the detail. If you look at the detail now, it's like the eye sockets have sunk in, her skin almost looks porcelain, cracked and chapped. The lips have all, and the gums are receding. You can see rot appearing on the face, as well as just, it looks like she has no nose at all, and the wispy hair, the pencil strokes and everything. It just terrific illustrations, and I'm just gonna focus on this little beautiful mug for a bit. You having nightmares yet? Well, it's Halloween. I certainly hope so. The haunt sort of swayed, like she didn't know what to do. Then she just faded out. The old preacher waited, and when he didn't hear any more noises, he went over and shut the door. He was sweating and trembling all over, but he was a brave man, and he thought he'd be able to see it through. So he turned his chair to where he could watch, and he sat down and waited. It wasn't long before he heard the haunt start up again. Slowly. Step, 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 step. Closer and closer. Step, step. And it was right at the door. The preacher stood up and held his Bible out before him. Then the knob slowly turned and the door opened wide. This time the preacher spoke soft or quiet-like. He said, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, who are you, and what do you want?" The haunt came right across the room, straight to him, and took hold of his coat. It was a young woman, about 20 years old. Her hair was torn and tangled, and the flesh was dropping off her face, so he could see the bones and part of her teeth. She had no eyeballs, but there was a sort of blue light way back in her eye sockets, and she had no nose to her face. Then she started talking. It sounded like her voice was coming and going with the wind blowing it. She told how her lover had killed her for money and buried her in the cellar. She said if the preacher would dig up her bones and bury her properly, she could rest. Then she told him to take the end joint of the little finger from her left hand and to lay it in the collection plate at the next church meeting, and he'd find out who had murdered her. And she said, if you come back here once more after that, you'll hear my voice at midnight, and I'll tell you where my money is hid, and you can give it to the church. The haunt sobbed like she was tired, and she sunk down toward the floor and was gone. The preacher found her bones and buried them in the graveyard. The haunt sobbed, apologies, already read that part. The next Sunday, the preacher put the finger bone in the collection plate, and when a certain man happened to touch it, it stuck to his hand. The man jumped up and rubbed and scraped and tore at the bone, trying to get it off. Then he went to screaming like he was going crazy. Well, he confessed to the murder, and they took him on to jail. After the man was hung, the preacher went back to the house one midnight, and the haunt's voice told him to dig under the hearth rock. He did, and he found a big sack of money. And where that haunt had held onto his coat, the print of those bony fingers was burned right into the cloth. It never did come out. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I think that is just, well, it's got a bit of a happy ending, don't get me wrong, but it's quite horrific, especially with the illustrations. But we're going to look through if there's a little chapter. There we go. I'll just pick the story at random. Let's see. Let's see. Let's pick Room for One More on page 47. I like the sound of that. It sounds like it could be quite sinister. So let's just flip to 47. There we are. It's a bit shorter than that last one. Room for One More. A man named Joseph Blackwell came to Philadelphia on a business trip. He stayed with friends in the big house they owned outside the city. That night, they had a good time visiting. But when Blackwell went to bed, he tossed and turned and he couldn't sleep. Sometime during the night, he heard a car turn into the driveway. He went to the window to see who was arriving at such a late hour. In the moonlight, he saw a long black hearse filled with people. The driver of the hearse looked up at him. When Blackwell saw his queer, hideous face, he shuddered. The driver called to him, "There is room for one more." Then he waited for a minute or two, and he drove off. In the morning, Blackwell told his friends what had happened. "You were dreaming," they said. "I must have been," he said, "but it didn't seem like a dream." After breakfast, he went into Philadelphia. He spent the day high above the city in one of those new office blocks or office buildings there. Late in the afternoon, he was waiting for an elevator to take him back down to the street, but when it arrived, it was very crowded. One of the passengers looked out and called to him. "There is room for one more," he said. It was the driver of the hearse. "No thanks," said Blackwell. I'll get the next one." The doors closed, and the elevator started down. There was shrieking and screaming and the sound of a crash. The elevator had fallen to the bottom of the shaft. Everyone aboard was killed. Well, sounds to me like he made a good call on getting in that elevator. I mean, have you ever seen the movie Devil? As much a piece of crap as that movie was, from what I've heard. You know, elevators, not a good spot to be in a horror scenario. I'll read a few more. This one sounds interesting. I've heard of this creature, the Wendigo. A wealthy man wanted to go hunting in a part of northern Canada where few people had ever hunted. He travelled to a trading post and tried to find a guide to take him, but no one would do it. It was too dangerous, they said. Finally, he found an Indian who needed money badly, and he agreed to take him. The Indian's name was Defago. Apologies if I mispronounced that. They made camp in the snow near a large frozen lake. For 3 days they hunted, but they had nothing to show for it. The third night, a windstorm came up. They lay in their tent, listening to the wind howling and the trees whipping back and forth. To see the storm better, the hunter opened the tent flap. What he saw startled him. There wasn't a breath of air stirring, and the trees were standing perfectly still. Yet he could hear the wind howling, and the more he listened, the more it sounded as if it were calling Defago's name. Defago. It called Defago. I must be losing my mind, the hunter thought. Ooh. Some footsteps in the snow, or footsteps in the grass, or even in an unknown background. We may never know. But I love these illustrations. There's so many great illustrations in this book. But Defago had gotten out of his sleeping bag. He was huddled in a corner of the tent, his head buried in his arms. Apologies, I'm a bit yawning. "What's this all about?" the hunter asked. "It's nothing," Defago said. But the wind continued to call to him, and Defago became more tense and more restless. Defago, it called. Defago. Suddenly he jumped to his feet and he began to run from the tent, but the hunter grabbed him and wrestled him to the ground. "You can't leave me out here," the hunter shouted. Then the wind called again, and Defago broke loose and ran into the darkness. The hunter could hear him, screaming as he went. Again and again he cried, "Oh, my fiery feet, my burning feet of fire." Then his voice faded away, and the wind died down. At daybreak, the hunter followed Defago's tracks in the snow. They went through the woods, down toward the lake, then out onto the ice. But soon he noticed something strange. The steps Defago had taken got longer and longer. They were so long no human being could have taken them. It was as if something had helped them to hurry away. The hunter followed the tracks out to the middle of the lake, but there they disappeared, At first he thought that Defago had fallen through the ice, but there wasn't any hole. Then he thought that something had pulled him off the ice into the sky, but that made no sense. As he stood wondering what happened, the wind picked up again. Soon it was howling as if the night, as it had the night before. Then he heard Defago's voice. It was coming from up above. And again he heard Defago screaming, "My fiery feet, my burning feet," but there was nothing to be seen. Now the hunter wanted to leave that place as fast as he could. He went back to camp and packed. Then he left some food for Defago, and he started out. Weeks later, he reached civilization. The following year, he went back to hunt in that area again. He went to the same trading post to look for a guide. The people there could not explain what had happened to Defago that night, but they had not seen him since then. "Maybe it was the Wendigo," one of them said, and he laughed. "It's supposed to come with the wind. It drags you along at great speed until your feet are burned away, and more of you than that. Then it carries you into the sky, and it drops you." It's just a crazy story, but that's what some of the Indians say. A few days later, the hunter was at the trading post again. An Indian came in and sat by the fire. He had a blanket wrapped around his face, wrapped around him, and he wore his hat so that you couldn't see his face. The hunter thought there was something familiar about him. He walked over and he asked, "Are you Defago?" The Indian didn't answer. "Do you know anything about him?" No answer. He began to wonder if something was wrong, if the man needed help, but he couldn't see his face. "Are you all right?" he asked. No answer. To get a look at him, he lifted the Indian's hat. Then he screamed. There was nothing under the hat but a pile of ashes. Well, I think that would be a good spot to call it a night with this video, guys. Let me know what you thought in the comments below, and if you'd like me to do more readings from this book or just more books in general, as I've had this book sitting for a while, and I figured because I had a tough time getting Slender the Arrival recorded in one sitting, so I'm gonna split several recording sessions of that game and upload them over the course of the coming weeks. So apologies for missing the big Slender video, but I promise you, pardon me, I'm awful yawny tonight. But I'll get everything sorted in the end, just doing my best. But with all that being said, this is Aurabot ASMR, signing off for the night. Till all